From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. It's the program where we sit around and talk about the city that we just like to sit around and talk about, especially right now, 5 days until Election Day for mayor and city council. Have you voted yet? Better yet, have you even decided who you're voting for yet? Well, it looks like the people have spoken. He's Ken Griffin, and he's all in with Mayor Bill Daley. So twice, in fact, two separate $1 million donations have happened. And on today's show, we'll ask our panel if it isn't just a foregone conclusion that Mayor Daley will take office in May, and whether he'll have to, will he have the stamina to withstand 5 elections? Because when he retires from office in 2039, he's going to be 90 years old. Anyway, there's a remote chance that that won't happen, and if you believe one of the polls released yesterday, it's now Daley 15, Lightfoot 14, Chico 14, Preckwinkle 12, and Mendoza 10. So no matter who wins on Tuesday, there's probably going to be about a 70% chance that the voters, at least 70% of the people who didn't vote for any one of these people. And another, 50% of eligible voters won't even vote at all. So to make sense of all of this, two of the best reporters in town covering this amazing, complicated election are here with us today to help you understand. Heather Cherone from the Daily Line making a triumphant return.
Thanks for having me.
And also making a triumphant return, Tahman Bradley from good old Channel 9 WGN-TV. Thank you, Tahman. Thanks for being here.
Good to see you.
I just learned that actually you're not working today. You're here doing this, so...
I'm always working. I'm always paying attention.
Well, no, a reporter is never off duty, after all. We know that. And Heather, the same thing. I don't think you've had a day off in like 7 months or something.
I've heard tell of this magical thing of a day off.
All right, so here's where I would like to start. The nightmare scenario with the poll numbers are so low that you could be number one maybe with 16% of the vote, right? And number two could be 12% of the vote. So doesn't that mean it's going to be a really long night next Tuesday night? Aren't we going to be up till 5 o'clock in the morning trying to figure out who the number 1 and number 2 mayor candidates are?
We might not even know on Tuesday, because one of the surprising things in this election is that the requests for mail-in ballots are up more than 100% over 2015. So people are voting at home on their own schedule, and they can postmark those ballots by midnight, February 26th. So it might be a while, depending on how many votes are cast in early voting and on Election Day, for the Chicago Board of Election Commissioners to actually count those votes, because they could prove decisive when you've got such a slim margin separating the candidates.
You're really just kind of ruining my whole day. You
yes,
really are.
That's my job, actually. It just says it right there.
We have public and private polling that shows that the person leading the pack is at about 15%, sometimes under it. In various polls.
The number one position.
The number one position.
Yeah.
That may or may not be true. Obviously, we have 14 candidates, so of course it's unlikely that anyone can win outright getting 50% plus one. But I wonder if perhaps
let's just take that off the table right now, right? Nobody's going to get 50% plus one.
I certainly don't think so.
Yeah.
But what I'm reminded of as we look at the polls as this winds down is back during the Democratic primary last year for governor. There was the assumption that Chris Kennedy had momentum coming down the stretch toward the end. That contest wasn't even close.
Yeah.
J.B. Pritzker was understated in the polls, and so I can't help but wonder if perhaps someone is understated in the polls, and it appears to be closer than it actually is.
I think that's right, because you have two candidates, Bill Daley and Tony Preckwinkle, who have proven ability to get voters to the poll, and they have the money to sort of make that happen. So I think you have to sort of at least assume that they're going to be able to turn out at least a sizable chunk of their base.
You say Bill Daley has proven ability?
Absolutely. He's got that old Daley machine. The gears might be a little rusty, but it's gearing back up. And as you said in the introduction, he's got, $2 million, just in the last couple of days given by Ken Griffin, who of course was Governor Bruce Rauner's largest campaign donor, and a good friend to current Mayor Rahm Emanuel. So, he's going to be able to get people to the polls. How that turns out, I think, is anybody's guess.
It's a a weird thing for me, but I have this kind of bifurcated relationship with Ken Griffin because I love the $12 million he spent on the lakefront. That was a really great civic thing, finally separating the bicycles from the pedestrians and all that. And I just wish that guys like that could just spend their money on that kind of thing and stop meddling with our politics. But that's another discussion.
Well, Ken, it raises lots of questions. What does he want? And so I asked Bill Daley that actually the other day, and he said he wants me to be mayor because he knows I'll be a great mayor. I'll fix our policing problems in the city. I'll grow the city to 3 million people. I'll make sure that we're not overtaxed. I'll work with Springfield to bring resources here. But you can't help but wonder, Ken Griffin was the biggest contributor to Bruce Rauner. And so this is something where Susana Mendoza has been on the attack and is pointing out that Bill Daley was a co-chair on Rauner's inaugural committee, or transition committee rather. Yeah. And so it does raise questions. What are you looking for? Are you looking for a conservative agenda out of the 5th floor of City Hall in Chicago?
Yeah, Bill Daley is in some ways promising a break from Rahm Emanuel, but in other ways is running very much what I would expect a third-term re-election campaign.
He's running like the incumbent.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
And, I think that you have to ask yourself, if voters are concerned about the city of Chicago, like the future, we have a huge pension crisis looming, we have significant policing problems, we have an affordable housing crisis, our voters are going to turn to Bill Daley, see that last name, and say, well, it wasn't all bad for those 40 years that his father and brother ran the city, so I feel comfortable voting for him. And of course, the other hand is Tony Preckwinkle saying, look, I've ran the county, I did a reasonable job, you can see my record there, however, I will govern in a more progressive way than Rahm Emanuel or Bill Daley. The question is can you really be a progressive while being the head of the Cook County Democratic Party? That seems to me to be at least an apparent contradiction in terms.
That's one of the things that has really caught my attention is that kind of on a similar vein to the national scene, we're beginning to see that there's a kind of a new progressive uprising happening in the country and perhaps even in Chicago. I'm not sure that it's as big as we sometimes think it is, but it's bigger than we thought it was 6 months ago or something like that. And we're seeing this in a lot of the ward races, but we're certainly seeing it in the mayoral races. I mean, when you see virtually all of the mayoral races saying things like, no, we have to rein in TIFs and those kinds of issues, you're seeing a tilt to the left that I hadn't even imagined a year ago could be possible. But I don't know if it's real or if it's just something that we're all blowing off steam about.
Well, look, it's a liberal city. It's a Democratic city for
sure.
Is it
really? Do you really believe it is?
Well, when you look at the history, when you look at the approach to crime, when you look at some of the business decisions that have been made, no. But socially, it's very liberal, and for example, Paul Vallis talks about when he was the CPS CEO, he negotiated a contract with the teachers whereby their same-sex spouse could get benefits. He did that in the late 90s. That's extremely progressive for the late 90s. Yeah. And so Chicago sometimes is in the forefront of left issues. I would argue that hasn't been as big of a factor, although the candidates mention it, but I don't think when you look at the news stories and sort of what we do, whether or not it's been a run to the left simply because these are not the most liberal people. They're when you start digging, they're very conservative, whether it's Susana Mendoza and her support for the death penalty, whether it's Bill Daley and drones in certain communities, tough on crime approach. So I haven't seen that play out as much in this particular contest.
Yeah. So I think this is one of the big unanswered questions that we'll at least have some idea of for an answer on Tuesday. Amara Enya, who's been running sort of perhaps the most progressive, the furthest left campaign, if she's got a path to the runoff, it's by expanding the electorate with younger voters, with more voters of color, and people who don't usually vote. So if that electorate expands, we may not have any idea what's going to happen on Tuesday, because there's a path for pretty much anybody to make it into the runoff, and that's her path. And if she does do better than I think somewhere around the 7 or 8% mark, people are going to say, there's actually sort of a base of support for, very liberal, very progressive policies. I don't know the answer to that question.
I would just argue we haven't seen that based on the data that we have, right?
That's
so
right.
we have public polling, and also I know that she wanted to have $3 million. That's what that campaign was budgeted for. She hasn't scratched the $1 million mark, despite huge high-profile donations from Chance the Rapper and Kanye West. So, I think they would tell you that they're doing smaller events around town, trying to organize people, turn out new voters. I just haven't seen any data to suggest that that's the case. And so, if she represents the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, I'm not sure that she does, but there's nothing to indicate that that's somehow going to infiltrate and take over city government with respect to the mayor's contest.
It's really interesting when you take this conversation and then you stir race into it, and the fact that we are such a culturally and physically segregated tribal city is what we are. And my view of it has always been that we're actually fundamentally a much more conservative city than we pretend to be. White people are all sort of in their enclaves, and they vote. Look, Chicago voted 30% for Donald Trump, if I'm not mistaken.
It was closer to 12%.
I'm sorry, I was thinking 13. I said 30. Yeah, but still, that's still a larger number than you might expect. And you see African American community very strongly for Willie Wilson, or had been for Dorothy Brown, who I consider to be fairly conservative people politically. So I'm just not really buying this thing that there's this big progressive movement. I think that we settle into our communities in a very conservative sort of way and then just kind of call it a day.
I think that's true, or at least it has been in the past. I think the question is there a Trump effect along the lines of we saw in the midterm elections, where we saw DuPage County, go blue. We saw the suburbs sort of turn against the Republican Party. And does that look like in Chicago voters turning against the more conservative candidates in the race? The Bill Daleys, the Willie Wilson, even, we haven't even mentioned Gary McCarthy yet. Right. And, he and sort of Jerry Joyce from the 19th Ward are sort of all running in that, for lack of a better term, white male conservative lane. Right. And I don't, do they get more than that 12% that Trump won in 2016? Right. That's also, I think, a question I'll be looking to
answer.
I
think leads me to the conclusion that we are this tribal, and I think that's a good term, we're this tribal city, and we're going to vote, and we now have, let's put it this way, we now have the opportunity to have specific hybrid candidates that hyper serve those biases and prejudices, and we're going to vote for them. So you're going to see nobody getting more than 13, 14, 15, 18%.
Because there's not some big boss to hold everything
That's
together.
right. That's right.
And you may see that play out in city council if some new faces appear, and you don't have a mayor who's as strong as Rahm Emanuel.
I mean, I don't want to go too far down this road, but if you think about Yugoslavia or something, right? You think about these totalitarian states that are held together by very, very strong people, and then they die or they go away, and the state just falls apart. And I'm wondering if we're not seeing some of that here.
Well, this is only the fourth open seat mayoral contest in the last 100 years. Us Chicagoans don't really have a whole lot of experience with what this is like. And I think a lot of people are, for lack of a better term, confused, right?
Not sure how you're supposed to vote. There's a way you were always supposed to vote.
Exactly.
Vote for Mayor Daley.
Exactly.
It's not hard. You just vote for Mayor Daley.
And whoever is elected mayor is going to face a very different city council. Regardless of whether Ed Burke and Pat Arcano are reelected, the city council will lose 100 years of experience just based on retirements. Yeah. So those are people who have been firmly entrenched in the way things always have been done. The people they will be replaced by, whoever wins, don't have that institutional memory or knowledge, and I think will be more open to changing the way things work. And what that means for somebody like Bill Daley, if they're elected, I mean, that's just just put the mayor and the city council at odds in a way that we haven't seen since the 80s.
Really, and you mentioned the sort of how we vote along race in the city of Chicago. So when we have a crowded field like this, 14 candidates, there are some candidates, I think, who are counting on a base of support, but potentially won't get that because you had another option. For example, Susana Mendoza clearly wanted, Latino voters, but we have polls that show Gary Chico outperforms her among Latino voters. And so it raises the question, well, what is her path to victory? What is her coalition? Who's voting for her? Her votes probably come from a little bit of everywhere, but that might not be enough. We know that African American voters are crucial. So Toni Preckwinkle from the very beginning has been making a play for that constituency. The announcement of her candidacy was at a hotel in Hyde Park.
I was there.
She had an event.
It was amazing.
Be fair to Toni. Valerie Jarrett was there. Black women were there. There was a DJ. All of that.
It was the most amazing gathering of 50-plus African Americans. It was an incredible thing.
And she's no party animal. She didn't really even appear until the very end.
I know.
So it was for other people because it's her crowd, but maybe it's not her crowd.
Exactly, that's the point.
I mean, it seems like ancient history, but let's not forget that she tried to kick 5 women of color out of the mayoral race with ballot challenges, and she ultimately only succeeded in getting Dorothy Brown off the ballot. But that, I think, is a clear indication that candidates see a lane, a base, and they want to clear that for themselves. And I think that it raises questions about the healthiness of Chicago's democracy, that people in 2019 still feel that need to sort of say, no, I'm the black female candidate. If you're looking for a black female as mayor, you've got to vote for me.
And what I'm looking for Tuesday, because African American voters are very savvy, right? Sort of held out support for Obama till he could prove he could win in Iowa, all sorts of examples. How well will Lori Lightfoot do? How well will Amara do? You've got some options. You've got people that are maybe way to the left of Toni, frankly. But are you strategic with your vote? Do you look at Bill Daley, who polls just as well as Preckwinkle in all of the public surveys that we have, who has more money than she has? Will you be strategic and get behind her? Will the vote coalesce, or will it split? I don't know the answer to that. I have suspicion that people will show up for her, and that some of the negative information about her hasn't landed, but we'll see.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think another factor that we haven't talked about is the fact that there is an ongoing federal corruption investigation of Chicago City Hall.
Did we go 20 minutes without talking?
The longest political discussion in the history of this election without bringing up Ed Berg. How about that?
Well, I'm happy I could fill that need. But I think, I've certainly had family members say to me, I'm not going to decide to vote until the last minute because I'm afraid that if I vote early, I'm going to end up voting for somebody who gets indicted.
I'm just wasting my vote.
Or charged. And I think that Susana Mendoza's campaign has really sort of had to play defense for a lot of the time. And let's remember, she was reelected comptroller in November, so she had a very sort of short turnaround to sort of, hey, I'm going to run for mayor of Chicago. And a lot of that time has been sort of spent explaining, well, yes, I got married at Ed Burke's house, and yes, Ann Burke is my political mentor. And yes, I took a lot of money from a company affiliated with Danny Solis, who we now know wore a wire at Chicago City Hall. And
but apart from all of that.
But apart from all of that, so I think people have been sort of keeping their powder dry and sort of trying to figure out, how are the chips going to fall?
And there was Moreno and a fellow with alleged ties to the mob. So she's had to explain and play defense the entire campaign.
It's interesting to me that, I guess we should move on a little bit from this, but one of the things is endorsements. Usually in an election, a good, powerful endorsement is worth something. In this election, I'm just not sure it matters. I mean, the former Vice President of the United States of America comes by and says, he's a good man, I liked him when I worked with him. And it may have moved the needle, but I doubt that it just doesn't seem like it's something that has that much of an effect in this election.
I thought the Sun-Times endorsement really sort of prompted a lot of people I know to take another look at Lori Lightfoot. I think people said, I thought she didn't have a chance, but if the Sun-Times is saying maybe she's got a chance, maybe I'll give her a different look, because maybe I was going to vote for Tony because I don't want Bill Daley. So maybe if Lori's got a shot, I'll take another look. So I think that was a surprise for a lot of people. I don't know that the Chicago Tribune endorsing Bill Daley made a lot of people say, oh, well, now I'm going to vote for Bill Daley.
I hadn't considered that.
Yeah, even though they have a long track record of their editorial board, sort of railing against the corruption of the Richard M. and Richard J. Daley years. So
I think how that may have helped him is it continues perhaps this march to inevitability, right?
The march to inevitability.
In his campaign, we mentioned he's running as the incumbent, and it's kind of Rahm Emanuel-esque. Got into the contest late, went up on TV right away, raised a lot of money, has always been leading the pack in fundraising. Skipped a lot of forums. Big ideas that probably have no chance of ever being implemented. Shrinking the council from 50 to 15, renaming the Dan Ryan Expressway for Barco. But you get attention, you get that stuff written up in the paper. Okay, you don't summon reporters like me and Heather to City Hall for a news conference. Instead, when it's strategically in your interest, you invite us and have a chat. That's a smart way to run your campaign. And so the Al Gore visit, copied by the Chicago Tribune, add that to Crane's. It all sort of shows this march of inevitability. And so perhaps if you are a white conservative in the city, and you're like, gosh, well, who am I going to go for here?
Gary
you see
McCarthy
Daley, everybody wants to back a winner. It's always good to look strong and to look like you're already in the runoff.
Yeah. So I think you've just named it, this election. This is the march to inevitability.
Maybe
when
not.
PBS does their bid.
maybe not.
Trademark Tom and Bradley.
If you want me to guess, that would be my guess. I don't know, right? Like that's why we do these things. But
I think it plays into this notion that Chicago is at its heart not governable, right? That we need somebody like Daley, who's like the Rahm sweater ad from 2015. I might not be the nicest, sweetest guy, but I know how to get things done, and that has been every message that Daley has said in many different ways. But I can do this. Chicago, I think, also feels like we have to be able to go to the federal government for help. Right? That was a big argument that Rahm Emanuel made. Elect me. I know President Obama. I know President Clinton. I know people in Washington. I can bring federal funds back to Chicago. There's a sense that if we elect, or if the city elects somebody like Lori Lightfoot, she's not going to have those connections. And I think people feel a little bit anxious about sort of losing that direct line to the federal government, which is very sort of machine politics, right?
Yes.
Because you want to elect an alderman.
You need Danny Rostenkowski and Mayor Daley.
Absolutely. You want to elect an alderman who's got the mayor's ear, so if you need a new trash can, you get a new trash can. That's the whole notion of Chicago machine politics, that on some level, as a native Chicagoan, feels normal to me. So the question is Daley making that appeal to normalcy, or is Chicago ready for change?
There's also this perception, this saying, I hate to start a sentence that way, right? But that the mayor of Chicago is a national figure. You have to be able to sometimes appear in the national press. And so what does that mean for someone like Willie Wilson, who has, who is a solid, rock solid, heart is in the right place, has given away a lot of his money, has propped up black churches on the south side and in the suburbs, on the west side. Best we can tell, a man of integrity. He built a company, made a lot of money, successful guy.
Came from nothing.
Came from nothing. Yes. Can he be mayor of the city of Chicago? Lori Lightfoot, the same thing. No matter how well the Chicago Sun-Times writes an endorsement, she's not tall, right? Does she have the gravitas to be? And so I think that's going to be tested.
I thought it was really interesting that little confrontation that happened with Martwick the other
day.
And I could actually see the clock ticking up. I could see the points ticking up on.
You thought it was a good look for her.
Yeah. Because you're right. She's about 2.5 feet shorter than him, but she's standing up to him and she's, taking him down. And, those are the kind of things that we like, right? We like to see our leaders showing their strength.
It was an iconic moment. If she ends up in the runoff, I think we might point to that moment.
Yes. Yeah.
That with the Sun-Times endorsement as a game changer. Because, think about what Martwick was there crashing this news conference about. So she had called the news conference because she wants the Cook County assessor, or he filed a bill to make the Cook County assessor an appointed position rather than an elected one. So Joe Barrios, lost to Fritz Kagi in the primary, and Joe Barrios was Cook County Democratic Party boss, and but Kagi beat him, and so it sort of was the party hitting back, like, no, all right, let's just be able to this appointed position anyway. And so she stood up to him and said, look, who benefits under that? Like, the voters need to have a say in how their property taxes are assessed. Are we going to give breaks to downtown skyscrapers, or are we going to at the expense of the poor? And so she said, you're just here. The only people who benefit under this legislation are property tax appeal lawyers. Like Tony Preckwinkle sent you here. A remarkable moment.
Yeah, it was. One of the things that is going to happen, this is known, is that this next council will be involved in the ward remap. And that is huge. It's one of those things that we just don't even consider. So, we lost Mel the last time. They had to bring him back to write the last. And as we've been saying, some of the great old lions are gone. So we could face a situation where this city council will be remapped by some kind of rookies, and I can't even imagine. As a Chicagoan, lifelong Chicagoan, it's like, how can you let some of these people who've only been in the council for 8 years or something make these big decisions?
You think a rookie is going to do that, not the mayor?
It was Ed Burke who really sort of, shepherded the last remap in. And even if he's reelected, he's facing a situation where his power is greatly diminished. Pat O'Connor was also greatly involved in that. I think he is facing a real challenge, a real political fight for his life. The other issue is that we've seen just a massive loss of African American population from the South and the West sides. So I think really whatever the next census shows, you're facing a situation where African Americans could lose 2 or more wards to be replaced by, majority Latino wards. And that, is just, it's impossible to overstate what a huge change that will be. And these aldermen...
The fight, those of us who remember the fight to get African Americans to some level of parity in the number of wards, and now that could shrink back. It's huge.
And, we're going to sort of see activists from the left pushing for some sort of fair mapping process to take that power away from the council members. There's always, 1 or 2 aldermen who get, sort of mapped out of their own wards
like
as part of retribution. I think Alderman Nicholas Sposato is a great example of how you fight back against that. He was remapped out of the 36th ward, put into the 38th ward, ran for the 38th ward seat, defeated 6 challengers outright without a runoff, and is now running unopposed.
And now he's unopposed. I know. It's incredible story. But I don't think I'm wrong about this, though, that this remap is going to be very important in so many ways. It's going to really deeply affect the way the city governs itself in the next 10 years or so.
The council is going to be very important. Look, these days of the 48-2 vote, I think, are done, no matter who's elected.
Even if it's
when
daily?
you look.
No, I'm serious.
Well, because I think people. I think there'll be new aldermen, and I think the Wagaspaks of the world who have been dying for an opportunity to lead will be able to lead in a more aggressive way. I really do. And when you look at something like a Lincoln Yard, right? There are a lot of people, whether they initially were for it or not, who wanted to pump the brakes. And so with the way that was done, as we look at ethics and we talk about like who's going to be appointed to committees and as that's restructured, and there's a lot of interest in that because of Burke, right? And Solis. I think we're going to have a situation where, you know, it just won't be the mayor and his planning commissioner, and here it is. You got a day to read it, and we'll take the vote.
Well, you haven't seen Daley campaign with any Aldermanic candidates. So nobody elected to the city council is going to owe their spot to him in the way that aldermen have owed their spots to money from RUM or to money from Richard M. Daley or the Cook County Democratic Party. So that may encourage aldermen to say, look, I don't need your help to get a majority of votes in my ward, and perhaps even your help will hurt me, because of course we saw several months ago Rahm Emanuel handing out checks to his allies on the council, and you know, Roderick Sawyer, the chairman of the Black Caucus running for re-election in the 6th Ward, you know, quickly gave that money to community groups because he knew it would hurt him more than it would help him. You know, I think when you start, you know, people start giving away money, that gives you a sense of sort of where, you know, really the push is coming to shove. So, you know, it will be interesting to see the fate of Lincoln Yards if it makes it through the council before Rahm Emanuel leaves office. It will.
Spoiler alert, it will.
Well, there are 11 aldermen who have told me that they will vote against it. 5 of those aldermen sit on the zoning committee. So that leaves only a few votes left to make it through that zoning committee, which of course is now chaired by Alderman James Kappelman.
I've never noticed you being this naive before.
I was going to say I'm with Ken. I'll believe it when I see it.
I'm
The problem
opening
with
it
some
up.
of these younger folks is that they think it's legit.
No.
I'm opening up the possibility that we will not see business as usual. I'm not saying it's going to happen.
You know, I'm just giving you a hard time.
Yes, absolutely.
I actually agree with what you're saying, but not on Lincoln Yards. Lincoln Yards, the cranes are already loaded on trucks. They're already on their way here.
$6 billion
Yes.
and 24,000 jobs.
It could be the last one of these for a while, perhaps.
Well,
That's
except for the 78.
That's already been approved.
Oh yeah,
That's
done.
Yeah, that's already been approved.
Done.
Right.
Well, the TIF hasn't been approved, but the development itself has already been approved.
What?
So we're focused a little bit on city council, which I think is a really good thing because we spend a little too much time talking about the mayor. Now, there are some races, and we've touched on them, that are really dicey. I mean, somebody like Pat O'Connor might not make it through. I think there's even well, I don't know if it's but there is some talk that, you know, that Joe Moore might be in trouble up in 49, up on the north side. There's a bunch of these.
Yeah. There really are. I think Joe Moore is in the political fight of his life. You know, he's an interesting case. He was elected during the Daley years as an independent. He then moved to be a very close ally of Rahm Emanuel. He's facing a challenge from Maria Haddon, who is a young, activist who's worked in the community at the grassroots level, who's saying Rogers Park needs to return to its roots as sort of a bastion of independent council representation.
An independent republic.
Yeah. I'll give a plug to the WBEZ Daily Line investigation that was just published this week that showed that if you gave an alderman an attendance grade, they would get Ds for attending committee hearings. And I think it'll be interesting to see whether there's more pressure put on aldermen who have sort of been operating as mayors of their ward as opposed to legislators of their ward.
Let's just dwell on this a little bit longer. Now, I don't live in John Arena's ward, but practically everything I have to do involves driving through it in some way or another. And I think I've seen maybe 9 John Arena signs, but I've seen about 95,000 signs for his main competitor, for banks, I guess. And I just am wondering, is that just the activists, or is he really in serious trouble up there? If he is, that would be an earth-shattering thing.
So John Arena won his seat on the city council in 2011 by less than 30 votes.
I know this because I used to follow you when you were writing from Jefferson Park. Yeah.
So in 2015, he defeated John Garrido, a Chicago police lieutenant who had been a frequent critic of his, by almost 1,500 votes. So So he's also facing Bob Bank, who has been the president of the Jefferson Park Neighborhood Association, as well as a firefighter named of Jim Gardner. So I think the question is, I think a runoff in that ward is almost inevitable, simply because it's sort of split half and half between Old Irving Park and Portage Park, where you're seeing a lot of people moving sort of north and west along the Blue Line to escape the rising rents of Logan Square and Wicker Park. Now, those are younger, sort of more progressive voters who appreciate that John Arena has been campaigning for affordable housing and sort of making Jefferson Park more dense. Now, that contrasts with the almost suburban, like Gladstone Park, Jefferson Park sort of part of the ward, where people who like their single-family homes don't necessarily want a whole lot of dense housing developments, and are not afraid to sort of campaign against dense housing developments, and in a lot of cases you don't want the racial and demographic makeup of the ward to change all that much. So that will also, I think, be a bellwether race.
It certainly would. It would certainly seem that way to me. Let's see. I just want to go through. Let me go through my little list here. Yeah, I think we've kind of covered most of these things, but I do think I think that it was really interesting that you brought up the thing about Washington, because that is something that it's just meant a lot to Chicagoans for decades and decades. It's like when you think about just the rapid transit to O'Hare, right? These are all just gifts that come to us from the federal government, and now we're talking about we haven't really had any serious talk in this campaign at all about public transit, which I think is a big deal. Yes, there's a possibility of the Red Line being extended to 130th Street, but it's looking less and less likely
There was a public transit forum, but they talked about Burke there.
But I know, because it was like nobody really wanted to talk about it, and we have massive public transportation issues with Metra falling apart, and we've never been able to separate out the freight train interference issues and all those kinds of things. That requires a lot of money. And we didn't talk about education even for 1 second here, did we?
Yeah.
Which is another one of those things that requires some money. And I guess I would conclude this by saying I think that one of the things that people are asking themselves, and that part of the reason why they're kind of holding off because they can't figure this out, is that people do understand this pension debt thing. It is massive, and it affects everybody in this city and will affect their children. And they need to know that whoever is going to come into this job is going to have some kind of a plan to get us out of that. Yeah. Although I don't know that it's possible to get us out of it.
I think Paul Vallis is really the only candidate who has a detailed step-by-step, here's how I would attack this pension crisis. And there are a lot of tough, hard decisions that people are going to be making. And a lot of the candidates that we've interviewed at the Daily Line have basically said, gosh, everything's on the table. Look at that sparkly unicorn thing over there. Let's change the subject. But Rahm Emanuel,
very good point.
Yeah. Rahm Emanuel is going to try to push through a $10 billion pension obligation bond after the election. It will be interesting to see what happens with that, because it could potentially ask aldermen facing runoffs to take a very potentially politically unpopular vote, because we in Illinois still bear the scars of Rod Blagojevich's pension obligation bond at the statewide level.
And part of his roadmap is to get Springfield to look at revisiting benefits and perhaps a constitutional amendment to change the pension guarantee protection clause. But J.B. Pritzker has signaled that's a non-starter for him.
Yeah. And Daley too, that's been one of his earliest things, is we have to reopen that pension clause. But I've had people at the table here saying that really doesn't make a lot of sense, because it's like you can already put new, what am I trying to say? The new cohorts coming in don't have to have the same benefits, and this group is already starting to die out anyway.
Well, I think the concern is the COLA, the cost of living, right?
The COLA,
so
right,
essentially, with the percent that it is, it ends up being not a cost of living adjustment, but rather a pay increase, is the way that it's framed, because it's quite generous. But I mean, the reality is we're on the hook for $1 billion more that has to go into these. That's going to come from somewhere. Somebody is going to likely be taxed, and it's a question of, will property owners be hit again? Will my grocery bag be a buck?
Right.
Or will there be some kind of, will we revisit corporate head tax? Will we?
A LaSalle Street financial transaction
Which
tax?
everybody says is a non-starter.
The skyscrapers are, somebody's going to pay for this.
Somebody's going to pay for this, yeah. Wow, what a great conversation. I really enjoyed having you both here today, thanks. And I think we conclude by saying we just don't have a clue what's going to happen on Tuesday, right?
I wouldn't put any money on anything.
Yeah.
I'm not betting away my small change.
Yeah. I honestly don't remember an election like this where it's just so completely up in the air, and there just don't seem to be any indicators other than more and more of the Mayor Daley thing, but
It will be fun, and that runoff's going to be a hell of a fight.
Yes, it will.
It is, it really is. All right, Tahman, thank you so much for coming again, and Heather, once again, it's just a pleasure having you both here, and maybe we'll catch you one more time sometime
Absolutely.
afterwards.
Anytime.
Anytime.
Okay, all right, thanks. You're watching Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. Don't forget you can watch all of our mayoral forums. We've got them all right here, like an hour with almost all of them, by going to this address and help you make up your mind maybe. And again, thanks to Heather Cherone from the Daily Line, a very great service that you should be partaking of, and WGN, which I understand is a very good television station. I understand it's been around for a while. Social media since 1922 on radio or something like that, right? Anyway, great, thanks again. Stick around, we're going to carry this conversation on in a different direction in just a moment or two. Just stay right where you are for about 8 seconds, thanks.
This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, we're back here on Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis, and a great thanks to Heather and Tahman. I really enjoyed having them here. They're both great, really good, well-informed reporters. But one of the things about this election that has me really confused, and I don't mind admitting I'm easily confused, but this one's really got me, is this whole thing about absentee ballots, and not absentee ballots, and I called that anymore. They're called mail-in ballots, and the role that they're probably going to play in this campaign. So last night, I was talking to Dave Resnick, our producer, and he started explaining it all to me, and I just said, hey, we need you as a guest. So Dave, come in here. Come on and sit down over here, because we're going to change roles here a little bit and have you be the guest for a few minutes. Hi.
Hi.
David Resnick is producer of Chicago Newsroom and a kind of a savant when it comes to some things about elections, and this is one of those.
I've been called worse, but
Yeah,
thank you.
I know. I've heard some of those things. So, we could be in a situation on election night where we not only don't know who the number 2 is, but we might not even know who the number 1 is.
Correct.
That really could happen.
That really likely will happen.
You talked to Jim Allen over...
This morning I had a conversation with Jim Allen, who's the spokesperson for the Board of Elections in the city. And he explained to me that in normal elections, and I use normal with quotes, the mail ballots and the provisional ballots, provisional ballots I'll explain in a minute, but the mail ballots, which we commonly called absentee ballots, were normally not very important. They were important to the people who cast them, but they rarely had any impact on the actual vote tallies.
Because Mayor Daley always won.
Right.
Right.
Or somebody.
Outright.
Correct.
Yeah.
And as everyone who knows anything about Chicago election knows, the last cycle was the first runoff we ever had.
Yeah.
There was no such thing.
Yeah.
Presumably it's become commonplace. I guess we'll see after Mayor Daley has his 5th term and he's 93 and they roll him in and roll him out.
Right.
That aside,
Yeah.
there have been 61,000 vote by mail applications,
Wow.
which is at least 100% increase from past municipal elections.
Wow.
And why that's significant is anyone who has cast their vote by mail ballot and has a valid postmark
Yeah.
by the 26th, which is election
Which
day,
is election day, yeah.
those votes have to be counted. They show up, and there's a staff, according to Jim, whose job it is to check before they ever open the envelope, before they have any idea what's been cast within that envelope.
Yeah.
They're responsible for verifying that the postmark or the postal signature is accurate. And the interesting part that Jim brought up, which I hadn't thought about, is If you look at your mail now, you don't really have postmarks anymore.
Yeah.
You have the little barcode
Right.
that is an embedded code as to when it was received and how it was routed and all of that minutia, which we won't get into.
Right.
The point is, as a ballot comes in, there is a staff of dedicated people who sit at the City Board of Elections and say, okay, based on what this says on the outside of the envelope, this is a valid vote. That valid vote is put into a pile, essentially, and then after all of the in-person and provisional ballots have been tabulated, a provisional ballot, I'll explain now. Someone who walks in on the day of and says, I want to vote, they may not be on the voter rolls, they may not be able to verify who they are at that point. They are given a ballot and it is marked as a provisional ballot. That becomes more important, again, in close elections because those factors could decide 1, 2, 3, win, lose.
We've heard about provisional ballots have played roles in other elections, national elections in the past, but generally
Correct.
speaking, they're such a minority thing.
Correct.
They represent such a minor number that they're not important.
A slight aside, as Jim explained to me this morning, Jim Allen from the Board of Elections, the number of early votes, where now in the municipalities and most municipalities, you don't have to give an excuse to early vote. You can walk in to any one there's one location in each of the 50 wards. You walk in, you vote, you're done.
Yeah.
Those numbers in this particular election are down, but that's offset, he believes, by the number of absentee or vote by mail applications.
So let me throw a theory out at
Please.
you. The early voting is down for
Correct.
reasons like, well, I think among all the people I know, people just can't figure out who they want to vote for, and so they're just saying, "Well, I'm not gonna lock in my vote for somebody who could tank in the next 4 days." And also, there could be somebody who could just suddenly show up as just like be a real surprise, and that would be the one I want to go for. So I'm strategically holding my vote until the very last day or until the end. But the other stuff, the early vote, I mean, that's the stuff we've always heard about with the ward healers and the people who walk the precincts. They are going out looking for people who they know are going to vote for their candidate, and they're trying to lock them in so they can't change their minds.
That is another thing I discussed with Jim. That's been a factor in many other elections, municipal and national elections. What he indicated to me this morning, which was surprising, was nobody really knows who their pluses are. The campaigns aren't really sure who their pluses are because the aperture between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 through 14 might be a percentage point or two. So getting out the vote, which is traditionally what, as you suggest, the ward healers do, no one really knows who their vote is.
So work and field is just a whole different animal.
Correct. And Jim also referenced in the last 2 gubernatorials, there was a concerted effort on the part of the campaigns on both sides to get their pluses out. So they had an apparatus set up within their campaigns to request these vote by mail applications so that their pluses, the people who were committed to them, would come out. What Jim indicated and others have indicated is it's anybody's game. So what could likely happen and what will likely happen, as your earlier panel discussed, is we will have a situation on the 26th at midnight or 1 or the 27th in the wee hours where we may know number 1 definitively. We may not know number 2. Number 1 and number 2 may change. Number 1 and number 2 and number 3 may change because as these vote by mail ballots come in, because the percentages will be so small between number 1 and number 2, there won't be an outcome,
So
which will be, and let me just finish.
Sorry.
The other part of that is, that means that these campaigns won't know how to start or who they're opposing. So if we know who number 1 is on the 27th, then normally you show up at the 95th Street Red Line station and you shake
Very
hands
next morning,
and you thank everybody. There could be 5 people standing there saying, thank you, I might have won, and if I have won, and if I'm in the runoff, and if you can vote for me in the runoff election, please do, but I'm not sure, but I think I've won. So the concession speeches or acceptance speeches, I mean, could be in July. I'm kidding, obviously, but we don't know when they'll happen.
But the second election is on April 6th, I believe,
Correct.
right? So, I mean, the time between January 26th and April 6th is a very small period of time.
February 27th.
February, yes, exactly. You know what I'm trying to say.
I do.
The time between these two elections
Correct.
is very small. So if a couple of weeks of that are going to be filled up with, hanging Chad kind of stuff.
And challenges of every kind.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm number...
So we could face the thing where the actual election is 10 days long.
It would be the British system, where it's a specific period of time and everything is defined in advance. Now, the other part of this, which is interesting...
But there aren't enough avails on
aren't.
all of radio and television to mount a 6-day or a 10-day campaign. You can't do it.
And there's also
the way we do
the
campaigns.
question of fundraising. I
Yeah,
mean, the
yeah.
dollars are going to follow the people who are in the runoff.
Right.
But if we don't know who number 2 is and we're not sure who number 1 is, and you're a smart money investor in municipal elections because you want to, curry influence, whatever it is,
Yeah.
who are you going to give your money to? I mean, Daley's already sucked up all the money in this election.
Right.
Does that mean if he's number 1, he sucks up all the money and there isn't any left for whoever number 2 is?
Yeah.
And then does number 3 challenge the election because it's a small, there's a whole question of recounts. When does the recount automatically happen? Is there, because this is unprecedented. There is no experience
playbook for this.
to define what the actions are. What Jim also said is, the last thing he said to me and the first thing he said to me is, make sure everybody votes.
Yeah.
In this election, every vote
has
will
got
count.
to vote, yeah.
Even if you don't know exactly who you're going to vote for,
Right,
make
right.
your decision and vote.
Now, that's an interesting issue. Let's say that, normally we would expect, what would we expect turnout on election day to be, about 30% or something?
In a municipal
27,
election.
something like that. Let's say that many, many more people come out. Let's say there's a 35 or 40% vote on election day. Then that solves the problem in many ways, right? Because there would be enough votes that you could pretty much determine a number 1 and number 2 without those, what did you say, 40,000 outstanding votes?
There's 61,000 applications.
61,000, yeah. Applications.
Applications.
But of course, we
don't
have
know
no
who-
way of knowing
No.
how many of them will come
We
back.
don't know how many will vote.
So it could be that a lot of people have applied and don't intend to mail in their vote,
Correct.
and they've become convinced in the last week leading up to the campaign, and they're just going to go out and vote, right?
Well, voter behavior, as we have all experienced, very, very hard to predict.
Yeah.
The turnout in municipals is lower. This one, obviously, because it's experienced so much media attention,
Yeah.
for good and bad,
Yeah.
has become what we can characterize as a high interest municipal, but still a municipal.
But we don't really know if it's a high interest municipal or not, do we? I mean,
No.
we really don't.
And the other factor that you touched on in your earlier panel, which is the coattail effect.
Yeah.
What we're going to see potentially is aldermanic elections having coattail effects on the mayoral
Yeah,
versus up ballot affecting down ballot. We may in fact see down ballot affecting up ballot.
A good point, because there are some very hot aldermanic races. I
Correct.
mean, well, we talked about some, like for example, the 40th ward, the 49th ward.
And there's also a great deal of interest in Latino wards.
Oh, absolutely,
We're
absolutely.
replacing 2 very long-term, powerful
That's right.
Latino
Right.
aldermen in Mr. Solis and forgive me for forgetting, you know who it is, the fellow who's had some issues with alcohol.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Who's there? We're both.
We weren't prepared to do
Right,
this.
right.
So without notes, it's amazing how
little more
transparent it
challenging.
becomes. We don't have notes in front of you. The point being, though, that if, for example, there's always been this talk about kind of an incipient youth vote that
Correct.
might show up on election day. Who knows? If it did, and if there were 20 or 30,000 of them, they could determine the election on election night.
And to that point, Ken, historically, a lot of the
Rick Munoz.
Rick Munoz. Sorry about that, Mr. Munoz. One of the cohorts who have voted in the vote by mail have been people on college campuses. And to your point about youth vote, they would constitute a very strong, and some would suggest unified youth vote. And as you alluded to in your panel earlier, that could help someone like Lori Lightfoot.
Yeah.
That could help an Amara Enya.
Yeah,
That could help possibly even a Neil Salas Griffin, who
Yeah.
is among the younger candidates.
Yeah.
So the conversation that people should be having, and I'm going to sound a little like a broken record, is even if you're not sure who to vote for, make a decision and cast your ballot. One of the things you didn't mention on the earlier segment is there's also an election for city clerk and city treasurer.
We didn't even get to it.
And the election for city treasurer is an interesting one because Mr. Pawar
Yeah.
is running
Amaya
against Ms.
Pawar,
Conyers
yeah,
Irving
yeah.
and Mr. Garapi. All three very qualified candidates, all three appealing to different constituencies. It hasn't gotten much attention because the oxygen has been sucked out of the conversation by the mayoral. And as you mentioned, the elections for aldermen, there will be a significant shift in age, if nothing else, in experience, because Marge Lorino in 39 is leaving, Solis is leaving, the aldermen from some other of the lakefront wards are facing serious challenges. So there's a lot of interest at that level. I think I've answered all your questions. If you still are sitting on a vote by mail application and you want to vote it, you still have time. Make sure, just for safety's sake, and Jim Allen was very clear about this, err on the side of getting it in early than late.
Yeah, but I would actually change that, and I would say if you're sitting on a
Vote by mail
ballot right now, throw it in the garbage and go out and vote on election day, because you will make us all so much more or less tense for the next couple of weeks afterwards.
And interestingly, Jim did bring up something else. With the advance of technology, the Board of Elections, if you provide them with a valid email address with your application, you will get a confirmation from them.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
That your ballot has been received. Which, and what Jim had mentioned, again, is that there has been some concern in the past. Well, how do I know it doesn't end up in the U.S. Postal Service dead letter file? Now you'll have some way of tracking it.
Yeah. Cool. And you also mentioned, we're literally out of time. You're the producer, you would know this stuff. Our clock is running out. But it's also interesting, this thing about what you were talking about earlier with me, with the Amazon effect, that people want to vote at home. They don't want to go all the way down to the school or whatever.
They want to get their pizza and their ballot, and they want
and watch it on the big screen.
Right,
TV.
and they want to seal their door because
all right, we got to go.
Right.
Thank you, David Resnick, producer of this show, Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. Please go out and vote, okay? I mean, I know it just sounds so cornball to say this, but it's never been more important. Go out and vote. See you next week here on Chicago Newsroom, and thanks for watching. We'll have a star-studded panel here next week to talk about what did or didn't happen. Thanks. Bye.